three of a series about money called Making Sense Out of Dollars. What is God's perspective on money? Okay, and we've been talking about this very uncomfortable subject for the past few weeks. We're concluding it next week. Lori's going to come up here and speak next week, and then Pastor Stan is going to end it with a Q&R thing at the end of next week's service. So if you have questions about money, if you have questions about what we've been talking about, jot them down, keep it in your pocket, bring it next week. And if you're home, you could chat it. You could chat it into the comment section. Yep. And if you're outdoors, we'll probably bring like a wireless mic to you next week. So if you have questions, feel free to ask from the outside area. And so let's just quickly recap what we've been talking about, because we've been talking about a lot. And today there is even more to talk about. And we were planning on making this a longer series, and then we were told we don't want to be uncomfortable for that long. So we're cramming everything in, and today it's going to be just dense. Okay, so quick recap. Last week we talked about how money is a spiritual issue. Jesus talked about it a lot, and I know we get uncomfortable when the church talks about money because we think the church just wants your money, but that's not the case. We talked about how when Jesus talked about money, he talked a lot about how to deal with money, not so much like, please give me your money, right? Jesus never, as we talked about this, Jesus talked a lot about money, but he only asked for money once, and that was for a sermon illustration, and we think he gave it back afterwards. So if anybody tells you God needs your money, then that's not true. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Everyone they're talking about, we're not here to grab whatever you worked really hard to earn, okay? But we do know that money is a spiritual issue, and today we're going to be talking more specifically the fact that it's not just a spiritual issue, that money is a spiritual tool. It's something that we should use to accomplish something, okay? So the first week, we talked about how money can be used to direct your heart. Jesus gave us that story about, that teaching about how wherever you put your treasure, your heart will follow. So if you always find yourself in trouble with the wrong person, or you always make the wrong purchase, or you're like, man, I don't know how I got into this issue in the first place, and you just kind of default to, well, the heart wants what it wants. Jesus teaches us that you could actually use your money, your wealth, your treasure as a tool to direct where your heart's going to go. So next time you think like, hey, I can't control my heart, you can. Jesus taught us how you can, right? Put your money into things that you think God is working on, and your heart will follow that also. That was 2 weeks ago. Last week, we talked about the tithe, because tithe is a very touchy subject. The tithe in the Old Testament was God's way of setting a healthy example of how to manage your wealth. We talked about how the tithe is really not 10%, right? Tithe is actually 23.3%, right? He said a tenth goes towards the people who are doing God's work, like the priests. Another 10% goes towards your family for these feasts, these celebrations. So make sure you put some money aside for that. And then every 3 years, you give 10%, so that's 3.3% a year, towards the people who are poor, the alien, the widow, the orphan, so you can help people out. Now, we as the church, people who live after the Old Testament, we are no longer bound to the tithe. We don't have to tithe. That's why at this church, we don't collect tithes, right? But what we are taught is that this was a healthy example of how with our wealth, we're not just accumulating things for ourselves, we're accumulating things for our community, our family, and for the people who need it. So this was God's way of trying to get us into this pattern of, money is not just for you. And he also talked about how as people who are called church, the Christians, we are called to give joyfully. So maybe in Old Testament, 23.3%, but for you, that's a bit much. And you're like, I don't think I could give joyfully if it was that much. So pray and talk with God, listen to him carefully, and if he says, hey, in this season of your life, I want you to give this much, do it joyfully, okay? And so there's no limit, or there's no set amount that you're supposed to give to this organization, that organization, to your church, the people who need it. It's between you and God. So that's what we talked about last week. So for the last few weeks, we've been talking about what money can do for you, right? It could direct your heart, right? Today, we're going to talk more about the dangers of money. Rather, we're going to talk about what money can do to you. And the Bible talks a lot about what money could do to you. It's actually a very dangerous thing. When Jesus talked about how you could direct your heart with money, he wasn't just doing that because hey, it'd be really fun, it'd be a fun trick, if you could control your heart, right? He wasn't doing that because he thought it was fun. He was teaching these things because he knew that there was this really dangerous force, this powerful force that money could generate that could corrupt your heart in such a really nasty way. As a matter of fact, it happens so subtly. A lot of times we don't even know it's happening to us. That even a few years from now, you'll look back and say, no, money has no effect on me, when it actually has. So the question we're going to answer today through the teachings of the scriptures is this: does my money have mastery over me? And I will guarantee you, majority of us would probably say no, because that's our first instinctual answer. No, of course not, right? But money is very, very sneaky. A lot of things happens to us without even knowing that it's happening to us. So today we're going to be looking at 4 verses. We're going to be looking at, 3 verses, and we're going to make a detour to 2 verses. So it's like 5 verses total. And you're like, oh, it's going to be a short sermon. Well, the first verse is pretty long, okay? And we're going to be spending a lot of time in these verses. So just get ready. We're just going to go through a few verses, but we're going to be talking a lot about it. Okay, so the first place we're going to look at is 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 17. This is how that starts. Command those who are rich in this present world, ... Command those who are rich. Now, if you're like me, when I was reading through the book of 1 Timothy, I got to that point and I thought, wow, there's a special section in the Bible just for rich people. I'm not one of them, so I'm just going to glance right over it, right? Like, you're like, this does not apply to me. Like, I didn't even know there was a section in the Bible just for rich people. Well, it turns out money has these undesirable side effects on us. And I'm going to talk about these side effects. And one of them, side effect number 1, okay, one of them is this: that rich people are unconvinced or really admit that they are actually rich. Okay? There was a Gallup poll that was taken. This is an old one. It's probably like 10 years old. They asked a group of people who just got out of high school, what do you consider to be rich? Because what they realized is rich is such a subjective label, right? You could be rich today, but compared to somebody else, you might not be rich. So they decided to ask a group of people who just got out of high school, what do you consider to be rich? How much money and liquidity, that you could just have in your pocket? How much money do you need to have to feel rich? And they said, this is 10 years ago, they said $15,000. So, I know you guys laugh, right? So the Gallup poll people, they went to people who had about $15,000 to spend and asked them, what do you consider to be rich? How much money do you need to have right now if you want to feel rich? And they thought about it and they said $50,000. So they went to the group of people who made $50,000 in their pockets and they said, hey, what do you consider to be rich? And they said $100,000, right? Now, this is a really interesting thing because everybody has a different definition of rich. So Money Magazine, so this is not Gallup poll anymore, Money Magazine did a poll to see for their readers, what do you consider to be rich? And this study was done about right before the pandemic, okay? So he said, what do you consider to be rich? Their answer, $5 million. If you have $5 million that you can spend it, in any way you want, then I will feel rich. So rich is an arbitrary label, right? And what they concluded was this, that nobody thinks they're rich, but everybody knows someone who is rich, right? You're like, I make this much amount of money, but I don't feel rich, but I know who's richer than me. That person I consider rich. But if you ask that person, they're going to be like, well, I do have this much money, but I don't feel rich, but I know somebody else who has more money than I do. That person is rich. And because of that, it's easy for us to skip over those verses that talk about the rich. And by the way, and this is kind of outdated information because this is from about the time that the Gallup poll was taken, so 10 years ago. If you make $44,000 to $45,000, entire household, so whether if it's one person or 2 people or many people in your house that's making money, right? If your household makes $44,000 to $45,000, you are in the top 1% of the world. 99% of the world will look at us and say that we are rich. And this is really interesting. When we talk about rich people, we say those rich people have yachts and they have private jets, and we think that's crazy, right? If you talk to 99% of the world and talk about Americans, they think we're crazy. They'll say things like this. These Americans, they all have cars? What? Yeah, sometimes more than one car in the house. And you know what they do? They get in this car that's old, it still runs perfectly, they drive it into a dealership lot, they pay the dealer money, and they give up their car, and they go home with a car that works just as well as the last one, but it's just newer. They're like, no, get out. No, really, they do that? It's like, yeah. I know, crazy, right? But no, they really do that. Like they share stories about, like, another story that I was shocked to hear is, did you know in that mystical land called America, you know what they do? They work 5 days a week and they could feed themselves for 7 days. Like, no. It's like, yeah. And not only that, in some households of like 4 or 5 people, only one of them has to work 5 days a week and feeds the whole family for 7 days. Like, get out. I mean, we take things like this for granted. So when Timothy talks about, by the way, the book of 1 Timothy was written from Paul to a guy, his protege named Timothy. It's called Timothy, but it's written by Paul. You gotta remember that. Okay, so let's look at this verse again. This is Paul telling Timothy, because Timothy is a pastor of a church. He says, Timothy, when you preach to your congregation, make sure you set some time aside to talk to the rich people. By his definition of rich, we all would fit into that category. So he said, command those who are rich in this present world. And this present world, this kind of catches you off guard. We're not going to talk about that, but later on in his letter, he talks more about this present world to the world to come. We're not going to talk about that, but just so you know, that's there if you want to read it for yourself, right? He says, here's the advice, here's the command that I want to tell the people. I want you to tell the people about being rich. He says, tell them not to be arrogant. What does he mean by that? Well, this is side effect number 2. Side effect number 2, rich people secretly think they are better than others. And you know what? I totally understand, right? Because if you're rich, if you have a lot more money, then you probably have a better education. You could afford a better education. You have a tutor. You could probably wear better clothes. You could probably have a better life. You have more opportunities. You have more connections. You live in a safer neighborhood. Better. It's not that much more of a step beyond that to assume, because everything is better than other people in the world, that you are a better person, that I'm a better human being. And it's something that we I don't know, like, I think it's something that we kind of pick up along the way. If I speak my language more eloquently than you, if I have a higher education or better degree than you, if I'm better, then eventually you'll start believing that you're a better person. And so Paul is telling Timothy to tell his congregation, make sure you teach them not to be arrogant, because every single human being has the image of God in them. And the image of God is not like person A has more of the image of God than person B. Like, your money doesn't determine who has more of God. Everybody has equally the image of God. Everybody's the same. So stop thinking, if you've been changed by your wealth somehow, if you have that little thought in your head, make sure you remember not to be arrogant. Then he continues, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Okay, there's so much packed here that's really important. This is side effect number 3. When you are rich, your hope begins to migrate towards the accumulation of wealth. This is what it means. You start to realize that all the problems you have in your life can be resolved with more money, right? Oh, there's something that's, okay, here's some money. And then somebody takes care of it. Oh, my roof is leaking. Money, problem solved, right? Oh, I need some help with this. Money, problem solved. And you start to think that money is the answer to all your problems, right? I'm going to share with you, by the way, this is still one verse. We're still in that first verse. I'm going to share with you the second verse. This is Proverbs chapter 18. This is a really good verse. This is written by Solomon, one of the wisest people ever in history. He said this, the wealth of the rich is their fortified city. When you have a lot of money, you could build up walls around you to shut everybody else out, all the problems out, right? You could do that. They imagine it, so it's not real, a wall too high to scale. Over time, when you're solving all your problems with money, you start thinking that money is the answer to all your problems, right? You could spend more and more to keep your problems at bay. And so you start thinking that money is the answer to all your problems. But this person, Solomon, says, no, that's just imagination. You're not really solving any problems. You're just paying other people to solve it for you. But as we say, more money, more problems, right? You spend more money and you solve that one issue, but a bigger problem arrives, right? So he says, this is all imaginary. So don't put your hope in money. But if you have a lot of money, you start to fool yourself in thinking that all the problems in your life is solved with money. For example, relational issues. If you spend a lot of money, you think you can solve that? Death. You think if you spend more money, you could avoid death? Addiction. Do you think if you spend more money, you could... No, there's a lot of issues in this world. Actually, the real issues of this world, like the division in this world. Do you think more money will solve that problem? War. More money is going to solve this problem? Like the biggest issues in this world are not resolvable with money. But the people who are wealthy, they could build walls around them and pretend like that stuff doesn't exist. And so Solomon says, be careful because you're just building these imaginary walls around you with your wealth, and you are now believing that it's actually a real fortified wall. Here's another one. This next verse I want to share with you is actually a memory verse. If you can memorize verses, I highly recommend you do this or even pray this. This is a prayer that my wife and we pray. This is how it goes. Keep falsehoods and lies far from me. Well, what do you mean by the falsehoods? Next verse. Give me neither poverty nor riches, but give me only my daily bread. There's this sweet middle ground. You can have too much money, you could have too less of money, but there's a sweet middle ground that this person is praying. He's like, I want that. I want to be right in the middle. Why? Well, what happens if I have too much? This is what he says. Otherwise, I may have too much and disown you and say, who is the Lord? If you have too much, when you start believing that money could solve all your issues, you start thinking that money is the answer to your problems. I don't need to pray anymore because I have money, right? I have no need for God if I have enough. As a matter of fact, John Wesley, we'll talk a little bit about him later in this sermon. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, he said the number one reason he traveled around the world, he talked to a lot of churches, a lot of people, he said the number one reason for atheism in this world is having too much. Think about that, right? But what if I don't fit into that category? What if I fit into the bottom category where I don't have enough? This is what he says about that. Or I may become poor and steal and so dishonor the name of my God. Like, so you don't want to have too little because you need to still have your needs met, right? You don't want to have too much because now you're putting your hope in money and not in God. So whether you like it or not, money, whether if you're too poor or too rich, has mastery over our lives. If you have too much, you're like, well, money has taken the place of God. I don't need God anymore. But remember, that's just an imagination, right? If you have too little, you are stealing things or you're begging things. You're taking things from people that don't belong to you, and now you're defaming God, right? So either way, money has mastery over your life. So this person is saying, I'm praying to God that he just gives me enough for my daily bread. Powerful prayer if you pray that, okay? Now, what I'm going to do in a second is, because I know what you guys are thinking, like, do I fit into one of these categories? Am I too rich? Am I too poor? Am I in the middle? Okay. If you're too poor, I think you know it's you, right? Okay. If you're too rich, I think this is the category where we don't really know if we fit into that category or not. So I'm going to do a little quick quiz with you guys, because this is a quiz that my professor in seminary did for me, okay? He said, if you want to know if you put your hope in wealth or in God, he said, I'm going to give you two statements. Okay, and he said, and before I put it on the wall, he said, I want you to think about if either of these statements were true, which of these statements will cause greater anxiety in your life? I'm like, okay, let's see which one it is, right? So he put this up. He said, first one is this: there is no God. So let that sit with you. How much anxiety does that create in your heart? And then he put the second statement: you have no money. I know, you're like, keep talking, Kotz. This is getting uncomfortable. Which one causes great anxiety in you? Which one have you put your hope in? You see, what Paul is telling Timothy, who's telling his church, is that he's not saying that money is bad. He's not saying that at all, okay? He's saying that when we put our hope in wealth, right, well, okay, he's like, that's understandable, but why don't we put our hope in the one who gives us the wealth? So let's look at 1 Timothy chapter 6 again. Command those who are rich, this present world, not to be arrogant, nor put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain because, right, it's imaginary in a lot of cases, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Put your hope in God, who is the one that is giving you the opportunities to make the money in the first place. So if we could put it very bluntly, This is what Paul is saying. He's kind of shrugging his shoulders, asking this question. He's saying, why hope in riches when you can place your hope in the one who richly provides? Right? It's okay that God is giving you this wealth. It's okay that you have a lot, right? But if you start putting your hope in that rather than the one who's giving you this, then he's like, that's a problem. So don't get arrogant. So here's a quick recap of the 3 issues that we're dealing with. A lot of people are unaware of their wealth status. A lot of people end up being arrogant without even knowing about it. And money becomes our hope instead of God. And all this points to the fact that money has mastery over our lives. Because all this stuff happened without you even knowing it. It's not like you woke up in the morning thinking like, today I'm just going to work a little harder. I'm being arrogant. So I'm better than you, better than you, better than you. How much do you make? Okay, you're better than me. You know, right? Like, you don't wake up doing that, right? It just naturally happens to you. This stuff is really subtle. So the question, so we just defined the problem. Okay, and Paul is like, I'm going to give you the problem first. I'm going to give you the solution later. Okay, so the question we're supposed to be asking at this point in reading the scriptures is this. How do we regain mastery over our wealth? Are we serving money or is money serving us? Remember, we talked about how money is a tool that we could use to bring heaven on earth, right? We want to have mastery over our stuff, not the stuff have mastery over us, right? So what do we do? Paul, please teach us. Teach us what are we supposed to do? Well, in the next verse, chapter 6, verse 18, he tells us exactly what to do. So he says, Timothy, command them to do good. Notice it doesn't say be good, because I think he already assumes that you are good people, right? He says, if you have a lot and you think you're turning into an arrogant person, if you think that you're better than other people, if you're starting to put your hope in money rather than in God, then here's the first thing you got to do. Do good. Not just be good, do good. And in case you didn't hear me, in case you zoomed right past this first line, let me repeat myself. He says, to be rich in good deeds. Like, do good. If you want to be rich, be rich. Like, if you're known for your wealth, be known for doing good deeds for people. Help other people who are in need. Listen to them. Visit them if they're alone. If they need a hug, give them a hug, right? Enter into their world so that you can understand how they're feeling. Be good people. Do good deeds. Be rich in good deeds. So he's like, here's the action part. Now, as for your wealth goes, this is what I want you to do. To be generous and willing to share. So top here, right here, do good works. Down here, be generous. Give things away. This is how you're going to have mastery. So math problems, for those of you who like math problems, this is the equation. Doing good works plus giving your wealth away equals mastery over your money. Now, notice, in case you're wondering if I have ulterior motives here, Paul is not talking about giving to the church here. He's just talking about giving things away because it could have a negative effect on you. For dramatic effect, yeah. Okay, can you guys hear me still? Yeah, okay. Outside, can you hear me? Okay, gotcha, okay. Okay, so I know, like, you guys are like, I don't like hearing about this, so I'm just gonna, Okay, so the assumption that Paul is making here is this, okay? That after your needs are met, so everybody needs money to take care of their needs, right? And your family, if you're taking care of your family, right? And after everything is met, like, you know, your retirement, everything, right? If you have excess over that, then you are considered to be rich. And the assumption that Paul's making here is that he's assuming that everybody with the excess that you have, that where you're using that is that you're wasting it on yourself. Like, you don't really need to use it, but you're like, since I have extra, I'm just going to do this little extra thing because I was, just want to try it, right? He's like, if you're going to waste your money, you might as well use it for something good. Use it for people who need it, right? Use it for people who are in desperate, or just give it away to some kind of organization, meaning you need to prioritize people outside of yourself. So the quick summary of Paul's solution to this problem is this. The only way to reverse the migration of your heart is to be generous. The only way. But here's the problem. And there's like a little semantic thing happening here, okay? There's a difference between showing generosity and being generous. There's a big difference between the two. I'll give you an example. Showing generosity is basically when you're like watching TV and then, I don't know if does this generation watch TV? Probably not. But maybe like a commercial comes up while you're watching YouTube because there's so many ads in the middle of a 5-minute video, right? And you're watching and all of a sudden this old man with like a beard comes out and says, hey, you could sponsor this child who hasn't eaten for 5 weeks, and there's like flies flying around and there's like sad music and all of a sudden the picture turns black and white and you're like, oh man, I'm so moved, I'm going to give. That's showing generosity, right? You're waiting to be moved before you give, right? Or maybe somebody makes you feel guilty. Like if what I'm doing right now is making you feel guilty, I know, feeling guilty at church, don't. Okay, and you're like, oh, I need to reach in my pocket and give. No, that's called showing generosity, okay? Or you're just waiting for somebody to ask you, hey, can you give me an extra change today? That's showing generosity. Oh, I have some leftovers, I'm just gonna give that away. Showing generosity. Being generous, okay, or being a generous person, or generous people pre-decide to give. This is what that means. You have your entire budget. You look at it and say, this is how much I need to survive. So this allotment right here, I'm just going to assume that this is for me to give away. So there's my food, my housing, right? My savings. And in your mind, you have to pre-decide how much you're going to put into savings, right? I'm also going to decide this is for my retirement, right? After all, this is for enjoyment, this is for family vacation. Everything after that's said and done, you're like, okay, this. So you pre-decide what you're going to do with it. Not, well, there's extra right here, so I'm going to use this, and if I tip into that, then the remainder of that, no. You have to prioritize giving. You have to pre-decide how much you're going to give away and who you're going to give it to. If you want to give it to some, organization or some person or whatever, that's fine, okay? But just pre-decide, because a generous person, it's already built into their assumption that every time they get their paycheck, they're just going to give it away, whatever that percentage is. And in many cases, it's their first fruits. They give it away right away. As a matter of fact, this is a quote from John Wesley. This is what he said. When I have money, I get rid of it quickly lest it find its way into my heart. He knows the danger, the lure, the mastery of money. He knows that it works subtly. He knows that the longer I hold on to it, the more I start planning, like, well, now I could build a second house, right? He says, no, it starts to work into my heart the longer I hold on to it. So what I'm going to do is as soon as I get it, I already know this much I'm going to give away right away. The money that you have, that God has given you, is not just for you. It's for you, but it's also for something else that God has planned. And you have to find out what that is. I can't tell you what it is. So, here's a quick summary. Do not place your hope in riches, but in Him who richly provides. Otherwise, your money, is going to start having mastery over you in your life. And the only way to reverse that, the migration of your heart to money, is to be generous. You see, money could be an awesome tool to do amazing things for this world, for your neighbor, for God's kingdom. You could do amazing things with money. But money has also a way of changing you without you even knowing it. And the way that that you're going to prevent that from happening is to build into your routine right now what you're going to live off of, what you're going to give away. And when you get that money, you give it away right away before it takes root in your heart. Now, I know that some of you are like, well, I don't know how much I spend because I don't budget anything. I know I have a bank account and I just spend it. And 5 months later, I look at my bank account and say, hey, look, I have a deficit, or hey, I'm above, right? Okay, remember, the money that you have is not your money. If you call yourself a Christian, if you follow Jesus, then everything that you are and everything you have belongs to God. You are a person who is managing the things that God has given you. If you want to be a good steward, you have to know how much you're spending every month, right? You have people to look at God and say, God, this month, this much is going to this cause, or this month, I'm going to spend it this way. Because remember, I said this in the very first sermon on this topic, it is difficult to call yourself a disciple of Jesus and not be good with your money. Because one day God might say, hey, in the next season of your life, I'm going to call you to go and take care of that person who is in need. And if for you to say, but God, I have no money, I can't help that person. I mean, missing out on opportunities of blessing the people around us, bringing heaven on earth, if we are not managing our money well. So, once again, do not place your hope in riches, but in him who richly provides. And the only way to reverse the migration of your heart to money is to be generous. Amen? All right, let's pray.